Hey everyone, this is Friedel Hacker Raven. I'm here with my recap review of the Gilded Age season number 1, episode number 7, titled Irresistible Change. And this was another fun episode, and I think only 2 more episodes are left because season 1 is going to be 9 episodes long, which I'm okay with. And this season has been renewed for this show has been renewed for a second season, which I'm excited about. And when I went to Wikipedia and saw the live ratings, from what I can tell, the ratings have been increasing week by week, which, I wasn't expecting the Gilded Age to be so much fun, especially after being a big fan of Downton Abbey. But the Gilded Age, amazing, I want more. So episode number 7 opens up with George basically giving a presentation about his railway station and how it will be powered by Thomas Edison's electricity and all of that stuff. And this George Russell is basically bringing the future to New York City, and everyone is excited about it, and they're like, yeah, let's do this. And also, if you guys remember from the previous episode, George also has this lawsuit that he needs to handle, but that doesn't mean that he can't continue making progress in his own business. Now, whether or not he will remain successful by the end of the season, I have no idea. So anyway, the presentation ended up going well, and this is where Larry and Mr. White are talking, and George comes in, and I guess Larry has decided to tell his father that he wants to become an architect right now, and Mr. White is like, are you sure you want to tell him right now? And Larry's like, yeah, I want to. So George comes in, and this is where Larry is like, Father, I want to talk to you. You are very impressed by Mr. White's designs and architecture, and I was thinking that, you know what, I can learn something from Mr. White. And George is like, what the heck are you talking about, Larry? And this is where Larry is like, well, I want to become an architect. I want a new job. And George is like, you have a job. You're working for me. And Mr. White tries to come in, and he tries to calm the situation down. He's like, you know what, Mr. Russell, Larry is basically just interested in architecture, and after learning the principles of architecture, in 3-4 years, he'll come back and he'll use what he's learned in order to grow your own business. And George is like, Larry, is that what you want? And Larry is like, no, Mr. White was lying. I want to become an architect. And George is like, I don't think so. But anyway, thanks for telling me. And he walks away with Gladys, and I'm like, oh, Larry, oh. So we cut to the Van Ryan house, and this is where, or did I miss an image? No, not necessarily. Okay, so this is where, my bad. But in the previous episode, we knew that Mrs. Armstrong ended up telling Agnes about Oscar basically having an affair with Miss Turner, and of course Agnes is trying to figure out how to handle the situation because she's already been betrayed by Banister, and now her own son is having these unsuitable liaisons with a lady's maid across the street, and of course Agnes isn't a fan of that, and Ada tries to calm the situation down, and you can actually see Jack in the background, and he kind of overhears what's happening, and Ada is like, you know what, Agnes, these things happen. Like, most men do end up having a fling when they're young, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything. So if I were you, I would actually advise that you don't say anything to Oscar. And Agnes is like, what the heck are you talking about? I wasn't expecting you to give me such responses. And Ada is like, well, I do know what happens in the world. What would have you preferred, that Oscar ended up having an affair with an actress or a prostitute? Shouldn't you be kind of happy that it's still a lady's maid? And all of the things that Ada is saying, they're taking Agnes by surprise, and she's like, oh no, Agnes. So you can tell that even though Agnes doesn't necessarily have a very how can you say that, a very strong personality like Agnes, she still knows something. She's still very observant, and she knows what happens in the world and whatnot. So Ada is like, please take my advice and don't say anything to Oscar. But of course Agnes does say something to Oscar later on in the episode. So Banister comes in asking about dinner or lunch, I guess, I'm not really sure. And of course Agnes is still not talking to Banister, especially after what he did in the previous episode. And Agnes is like, Ada, can you tell Mrs. Bauer that we'll have lunch by this specific time? And she's ignoring Banister. So we cut to George, and he's taking Bertha and Gladys to the carriage. And of course, Bertha is very, very interested in what George is working on. And Bertha is like, you know what? I was very impressed by your presentation, and I just want to know how when we'll have all of this electricity in our own home. And George is like, well, we're working on it. And yeah, she's very, very supportive of George. And then we cut to Banister, and it's looking at the check that Bertha gave him, and Mrs. Bauer is like, I think her name is Mrs. Bauer, right? The cook. Yeah, she's like, what are you going to do with that check? You don't have a bank account. And Banister's like, maybe I'll make one. And he's like, I also need to figure out who ended up telling Mrs. Van Ryn that I was working across the street. And Mrs. Bauer is like, okay, you do you. So Larry, after having a conversation with his dad, he's very disappointed with his response, and he's walking towards his house, and Marian walks up to him, and because she's walking Pumpkin, and Marian is like, okay, Larry, what's up? Why are you so bothered? Come on, why are you unhappy? And Larry is like, well, I had a quarrel with my father. He doesn't want me to become an architect. And Marian is like, well, you have one life, YOLO. So why don't you do what you want to do? And Larry is like, well, it's not that easy because Dad has plans for everyone. He has a set path for me, Gladys, even Mother, and you have to continue on that path or he'll become disappointed. And Marian is like, again, boo, YOLO. But yeah, let's see if Larry ends up walking away from his dad and pursuing his dreams. So we cut to the kitchen, and this is where Miss Turner is like, why are everyone so hyped about what Thomas Edison is doing? It's just electricity. We knew about electricity for quite a while now. And yeah, Mr. Church is like, well, that's not the reason why everyone is hyped up. It's that Mr. Edison has figured out how to harness the power of electricity for our benefit and whatnot. And as everyone is talking about the upcoming presentation, because there's this presentation where I guess Thomas Edison is going, I guess in the sense that I could be wrong, but yeah, Mr. Edison has planned to light up the New York building, the New York Times building, with electricity, if I remember correctly. But yeah, Bertha is planning a picnic there, and they're going to watch the presentation while having food and wine in the carriages, and everyone is trying to get ready for that. And yeah, Mrs. Turner isn't into it. Miss Turner is like, well, I still can't get the hype. And she also isn't very friendly with Mr. Banister. And yeah, Mr. Watson chimes in, and he's like, you know what, if electricity comes, our jobs will go, because soon enough all of the washing, the cooking, the cleaning, and everything will be done by electricity. So we cut to Gladys, and she's showing Miss Astor the ballroom. And of course, Miss Astor is very, very impressed after seeing the ballroom. She's like, this place is so huge. So anyway, these two are talking, and they're going over the guest list. And this is where Gladys is like, should I call upon Mr. Willem? If I remember his name correctly. And yeah, it turns out that it wasn't Mr. Raikes that Miss Astor has a crush on. It's basically Mr. Willem. And yeah, her mom doesn't want Miss Astor to continue having a connection with Mr. Willem, because apparently his father is what? A war profiteer. He profits from war or whatnot. And yeah, Mrs. Astor doesn't want anything to do with it. And Gladys is like, oh, come on. You still like him, so we'll invite him and whatnot. And as these two are talking, this is where Bertha comes in, and Gladys is like, well, I was just telling Miss Astor that we won't ever get a date for a ball, because whenever I bring it up, you postpone my ball. And Bertha's like, what the heck are you talking about, little girl? Of course I won't be postponing your ball. And of course Bertha is very excited because she wants to give her daughter a proper ball. Miss Astor will be there, other influential people from society will be there, and Bertha is very, very interested in climbing the ladder, and she's basically using Gladys's ball in order to benefit herself, which I think Gladys understands. I think she understands that, because Bertha is like, you know what, all of the kids that will be coming over for the dance, I'll be inviting their parents, because they can't miss the ball. And I also talked to Mr. McAllister about a good date for a ball, because we don't want to clash with someone else. So we cut to Mr. Russell, and he's talking to Clay and the rest of his legal team in order to figure out what the heck they need to do in order to handle the current lawsuit. And it turns out that there's a note that was written asking Mr. Dixon to buy these low quality clogs or whatnot, equipment for the train. And it turns out that according to the handwriting expert, it is Mr. Russell's handwriting. There's a signature down there. And I'm like, oh. So basically, Mr. Russell is in trouble. And also because he's a very rich person, the jury might be against him. And yeah, the legal team is like, Mr. Russell, you need to be ready for everything. And Mr. Russell is like, don't worry. Mr. Russell, basically addressing himself in third person, he's like, Mr. Russell is always ready. So Marian is coming downstairs and she sees Oscar storm out of the house, and she's like, Cousin Oscar, but he doesn't listen. He walks away and he slams the door behind him, and Marian goes in and she's like, okay, aunts, what happened? And this is where Agnes is like, well, he has tarnished the family name and yada yada yada. He's having an affair with Mrs. Russell's maid and blah 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 blah. And Marian is like, okay. And yeah, Agnes is like, well, you know what I want? I want Mrs. Russell's lady's maid to be fired. And Marian is like, how the heck are you gonna pull that? And Agnes is like, well, it's not going to be me. It's going to be you, because you know Mrs. Russell. So I want you to go over, talk to Mrs. Russell, and tell her to fire her lady's maid. And Marian is like, I have no right to tell another woman to fire her lady's maid. And Agnes is like, well, it's a direct order from me, Marian, and will you defy me? And also, it's your family's name on a line, so it is your quarrel, so do it. And I guess Marian has no other choice. She needs to do it. So Jack decides to go downstairs, and they're all eating dinner. And because Oscar went away, they have ice cream to share between themselves. And Jack is like, well, Mr. Oscar is in trouble. He was fighting with his mom about something. And yeah, this is where Mrs. Armstrong is like, well, they are mother and son, right? And mother and sons do fight. But yeah, Peggy is like, I think there's something that you aren't telling us, Mrs. Armstrong. And Mrs. Armstrong is like, oh, silly me. I forgot something that I needed to wash upstairs. And she walks away. And Peggy is like, I think that Mrs. Armstrong knows something. And Mrs. Bauer is like, well, ladies' maids always know something. So maybe Peggy will find out. Who knows? So we get to see Bertha talking to Mr. Russell, and Mr. Russell basically kind of lost his temper a bit in this particular scene, which is understandable, especially considering the pressure that he's currently under. So Bertha is like, well, I've set the date for the ball and yada yada yada, and I just don't want your lawsuit to mess things up. And Mr. Russell is like, it's kind of very comforting to know that my own wife is more concerned about a stupid ball instead of myself, and that I could actually go to jail. And Bertha is like, George? Basically from her face, I was like, okay, so Bertha, I think, understood that she kind of messed up during the scene. She should have been more supportive of her husband, which she kind of is later on in the episode. But I was like, Bertha, come on, read the room. So we cut to Peggy, and she's talking to Mr. Fortune, and Mr. Fortune and Peggy are very, very excited about the upcoming presentation where Mr. Edison will be using electricity to turn on the New York Times Square and the New York Times building. And yeah, this is where Mr. Fortune is like, well, everyone is hyped up about Mr. Thomas Edison, but there's also this black man who ended up creating the filament that's used in light bulbs and whatnot. And yeah, basically they both know that only the white guy will be getting all of the fame and whatnot. But anyway, Mr. Fortune is like, I would like you to come with me to the presentation because we'll be writing about it, and I want you to interview people in the crowd in order to learn about their opinions and whatnot. And Peggy is like, yeah, let's do this. And I'm here for these two. I'm here for this. So Marian decides to go over to Mrs. Russell because she basically has no other choice. And she's like, Mrs. Russell, my aunt is very, very worried and she wants you to do something. And Bertha is like, okay, Marian, what's up? And Marian is like, well, my aunt wants you to fire your lady's maid because she thinks that she's having an affair with a young man. And I won't give the young man's name, but will you fire her? And Bertha is like, well, I just can't. I need more proof. And Marian is like, that's exactly what I told my aunt, but she wouldn't listen. But you know what? I'm just a messenger. So I've told you that Miss Turner is basically having an affair with a young man from a good family. So yeah. And Bertha's like, you know what? Let's change the subject. Anyway, we'll be going to this picnic thing during the presentation. And I wanted to ask your permission regarding whether or not I should invite Mr. Raikes to the presentation. And Marian is like, yeah, I think you can invite him. And she's like, it sounds wonderful. Can I come? And Bertha is like, oh, sorry, dear, you can't come because I think Miss Bingham is going to come. and she basically took your seat. And I'm like, oh, Berta, really? Marian is the one who supported you from the beginning, basically, and now you're just not taking her, even though you know that there's something up between her and Mr. Raikes. But yeah, that's Berta for you, I guess, and maybe Marian will have her revenge, who knows. So we got to the kitchen, and this is where they again show Mr. Boulevard, whatever his name is, and Mr. Church basically being grated, being annoyed by Miss Turner, because Miss Turner is, I guess she's talking about what, that Berta won't necessarily, that she kind of sees through Berta, and how Mr. McAllister being invited is basically Berta's way in order to keep climbing the ladder and whatnot. And yeah, Mr. Church is like, you know what, crawl back into your cave, Miss Turner, crawl back into your cave. So, Marian, after talking to Berta, she's coming back home, and she notices Tom waiting for her outside, and she's like, oh, Tom, what would have you done if I didn't come out? And Tom is like, well, I would have waited for another hour, and I would have walked away. This isn't the first time I've done so. And I'm like, okay, it's kind of creepy, but it's kind of also romantic, in a sense. So Marian is like, well, we can both talk, but not in front of the house, because Aunt Agnes might see from the window. So they walk a few steps away from the house, and this is where Mr. Raikes basically again tells Marian that he's in love with her, and he wants to be with her, he wants to talk to her. And Marian is like, well, I guess that can be arranged, because Mrs. Chamberlain basically invited, she basically offered to host us at her house, so I guess we can talk there. And Mr. Raikes is like, yeah, let's do that. So Berta decides to go and show support to her husband. Before that happens, she is like, Russell, okay, what's up? What's bothering you? And also, I need to talk to you about basically Mrs. Van Ryan wanting me to fire Miss Turner, because yeah, Berta is smart. Berta is like, you know what I think? I think that Miss Turner is having an affair with Oscar Van Ryan. And Mr. Russell is like, yeah, Oscar Van Ryan just wrote to me showing me support. And Berta is like, okay, so what do you want me to do? So should I fire Miss Turner? And yeah, George is like, well, it's not my place to say. And this is where Berta is like, okay, I kind of know that I messed up in the previous scenes, so I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to support my husband. And she's like, George, how can anyone even think that you're the one who ended up asking Mr. Dixon to do that with the train, buy the low quality parts? And yeah, this is where Mr. Russell is like, well, I am rich, so that makes me the villain in front of the jury's eyes, so I can't help it. We are trying to work on the lawsuit, but I'm not really sure if I'll be able to win this. And Berta is like, you know what, I'm not going to allow anyone to ruin my day, and I've already confirmed the date for the picnic, and I'm just going to ignore the lawsuit. And Russell is like, well, if that gives you the feeling that you're in control of things, well, I'm okay with it, Berta. And I actually like seeing Berta supporting her husband. So Oscar is back, and it turns out that he ended up mending his relationship with his mom. So Marian is like, okay, so how did you manage that? And Oscar is like, well, she wasn't going to hear my truth, so I ended up accepting her lie. So I guess Oscar basically lied to her mom, and he's like, yep, I was having a thing with Miss Turner, yada yada yada, it happens. And Marian is like, okay, if you say so. So we cut to Berta, and she's walking, and she ends up noticing Larry and Miss Turner on upstairs. And yeah, Miss Turner and Larry are basically joking. And I think they're talking about Mr. Church. And Berta notices, and Berta is like, because Marian told Berta that someone saw Miss Turner touch Mr. Oscar, not Oscar's, the other guy's shoulders. And Miss Turner kind of does the same thing with Larry. And Berta is like, is Miss Turner basically having an affair with Larry? I can't allow that. So Miss Turner is helping Berta get ready, and this is where Berta is like, well, Turner, I have thought about this, and I think that we should go on a break. It's time for you to move on in your professional life. And Miss Turner's like, what are you talking about? And Berta's like, yeah, I don't feel that we are connecting like we used to, and so I'm going to fire you, even though I'm going to give you a very good reference. And Miss Turner's like, is this Mr. George's decision? And Berta's like, yeah, if you can think that. Also, do you want to say something to me? And Miss Turner's like, no, I don't. And she walks away. So Banister ends up taking a note to Agnes, and Agnes reads it, and she's like, Ada, tell Banister that I got the note, and that he should ask Jack for some tips about how to serve luncheon. And yeah, Agnes is still mad at Banister. So it turns out that from the note that Mrs. Russell did indeed fire Miss Turner, and of course Agnes is very happy about it, and she's like, Marian, you did it! Yay! So it's night time, and George is going through some papers, and Miss Turner decides to walk into his bedroom again, and I was like, no, please don't. He just kind of had a little squabble with Bertha, and I don't want these two to hook up just before Miss Turner has just been fired. And yeah, thankfully it doesn't happen. But Miss Turner is like, you know what, Mr. George Russell, you basically couldn't understand where I was coming from when I came to you previously. I'm here presenting myself as a woman who will be 100% devoted to you, your success, and nothing more. And I'm not really sure that your wife is able to do that. And just think about it. If you take away all your success and all your money, will your wife still be standing with you? And Russell is like, Turner, just get the heck out of my room. And Miss Turner is like, well, we'll see each other again soon. And Russell is like, yeah, I doubt it. So Marian and Raikes are at Mrs. Chamberlain's house, and this is where these two are talking about Bertha's upcoming picnic. And Marian is like, well, I wanted to go, but there aren't any more seats in the carriage. And Raikes is like, well, I will uninvite myself, and you can go in my place. And Marian is like, well, that's not... it's okay. You don't need to do that for me. And this is where Mr. Raikes tells her about Miss Bigsby, again, if I remember her name correctly. And basically, she's supposed to be the niece, in quotation marks, the niece of someone rich. Basically, I guess Mr. Raikes is alluding to the fact that Miss Bigsby is basically that rich man's actual daughter, because he also gives her allowance and whatnot. So yeah, Marian is like, well, it's kind of hypocritical about there's a bit of hypocrisy over here, that certain people are still accepted back into society, but Mrs. Chamberlain isn't, after her past discretions and whatnot. So anyway, this is where these two talk about how, again, they're both in love, and that they should let go of society, and they shouldn't really give too much attention to what Marian's aunts think. And Marian's like, you need to give me time, Mr. Raikes. You need to give me some time to figure out things. So we cut to Oscar and Miss Turner walking in the park, and Miss Turner is like, I have been fired by Mrs. Russell. So these two are talking about how their little arrangement needs to come to an end now that Miss Turner has been fired. And yeah, Oscar is like, well, I do appreciate all of the help you have given me up to this point. And I think that it's going to be easy for me to get to Gladys now, because yeah, Bertha is going to give her a ball, and then she'll be allowed to go to other parties and whatnot. And yeah, Miss Turner is like, well, I bid you good luck, and I hope she fails. And Oscar is like, why would you think that? And she's like, well, Miss Russell is basically planning something very big for her daughter, and I guess she wants her to marry her off to a very wealthy person, and I'll be very happy if Gladys ends up marrying you, Mr. Oscar. And Oscar is like, okay, that was a kind of a backhanded compliment. So we cut to Banister, and he ends up getting a note from Miss Turner telling him that she's been fired and she's going away. And I think she also tells Banister about who ended up writing the note to Mrs. Van Ryan. And Jack is like, what you're going to do with this information? And Banister's like, well, I need to think about this, because as they say, revenge is a dish served cold. Now, there is a fan theory that it was actually Mrs. Russell who ends up telling Mrs. Van Ryan about Banister being there. But let's see if that's actually what happens. So, Mrs. Chamberlain is showing Marian and Tom Raikes her gallery, and as they're walking, this is where Mrs. Chamberlain is like, you know what, I would like to give you some advice from someone who has kind of been through all of this. Now, when you're young, it can feel very easy to turn your back on society. However, with age and as you grow older, you might end up regretting your decisions. So, before you do anything rash, I want you to really figure out whether or not you're in love. It's so much love that turning your back on society won't mean anything. Like 10 years from now or decades from now, basically the same way that it didn't mean anything to me, because I was very in love with the man that I was in love with. And yeah, Marian and Raikes then kind of talk to each other about this, because Mrs. Chamberlain walks away and they kiss, and I'm like, oh, Tom, he just really wants to kiss Marian, huh? He just really wants to be with her. And again, I'm kind of side-eyeing Tom, but I'm also like, maybe he's really in love with her, because he actually tells her to marry him, and he knows that she doesn't have a lot of money. So I guess there's love there, or maybe he's confused. I have no idea. And yeah, these two kiss, and Tom is like, you know what, we'll talk later. and I need to go. And Miriam's like, are you sure that you can leave all of the society stuff for me? And Tom is like, yeah, I can do that. So we got to Agnes, and she's basically dressing up. She's, I guess, having new clothes made. And as these two are talking, as all of this is happening, Agnes and Ada talk about Marian and Tom Raikes. And Ada is like, well, Agnes, what will you do if Marian makes a decision about being with Tom Raikes? Will you cut her off? And Agnes is like, well, I won't cut her off, but I want her to think that I'll cut her off, because even though it's probably easy for Marian to let go of society and all of the money, I highly doubt it will be easy for Tom Raikes to do that. And Agnes is like, Ada is like, well, maybe you misjudged him, right? And Agnes is like, highly unlikely. So yeah, again, let's see what happens between Marian and Tom Raikes. So Larry decides to talk to his father again, and he's like, Father, I do understand that you're in a lot of trouble, but again, I have to tell you that I don't want to continue working for you. I want to become an architect. And this is where Russell is like, Larry, boy, I need you to tell me why you want to become an architect. Come on, spill it. And yeah, Larry basically makes his case, and he's like, well, you are a genius, father, when it comes to what you do, and I have no chance of ever living up to your success and your legacy and whatnot. Whatever I do, I will always be second best. I will always be in your shadow. However, if I end up pursuing a different profession like architecture, then I'll be able to make a name for myself. And George is like, well, I kind of understand where you're coming from, but who the heck is going to handle all of the business? And Larry is like, well, you'll find new people to train them, and they'll handle the business and secure mine and Gladys's futures. But I just can't do this, Daddy. I want to become an architect. And Russell is like, well, I'll think about this. And then we cut to Oscar basically sitting down with his boyfriend John, and he's like, yeah, Miss Turner won't be giving me information about the Russell house anymore. But it kind of worked out, because now people think that I ended up having an affair with Mrs. Russell, which other men might actually be impressed with, I guess. And yeah, John is like, his name is John Adams, right? Yeah, John is like, Oscar, were you really expecting the rumor to fly about you and Miss Turner, and you were expecting all of this? And Oscar is like, yeah, I guess I kind of was. And because when it comes to me, I use every opportunity to my benefit. And I'm like, Adam, yeah, John Adam deserves someone better. I really hope Oscar really loves John Adam, but I could be wrong. So Marian decides to sit down with Aunt Agnes, and this is where she ends up talking to her about Mr. Raikes and how he's being respected in society and everyone likes him, and he's even liked by the families that Agnes likes. And Agnes is like, I know what you're doing, Marian, I know what you're doing, but let me tell you this, I am not blinded by Tom Raikes' charm and good looks, and you know what, I still don't like him. And Marian just walks away. And also, I forgot, after Mrs. Russell basically sent Agnes the note about firing Miss Turner, Agnes told Peggy to reply to Mrs. Turner and basically say thank you. So Marian decides to go into Peggy's room, and Peggy's getting ready, and Marian's like, where are you going? And Peggy's like, well, I wanted to tell you, but I didn't, because I didn't want to make you feel bad, but Mr. Fortune asked me to go to the presentation, so I'm headed there. And Marian's like, oh, I'm so jealous, I would have loved to come with you. And also Mrs. Russell is going there for a picnic and whatnot. And Peggy is like, weren't you invited to the picnic? And Marian is like, well, I wasn't. There weren't a lot of seats on the carriage. And Peggy is like, well, Mrs. Russell should have gotten a bigger carriage. Again, the fact that Bertha left Marian like that, I really hope that Marian tells something. She basically puts her foot down in front of Bertha. But let's see what happens. So Bertha is ready, George Russell is ready, and yeah, everyone's ready. So off to the presentation they go. And while that's happening, the aunts and Marian are sitting down, and this is where Ada is like, you know what, this is all very exciting that Thomas Edison is using electricity to our benefit. It's the way of the future and whatnot. And yeah, Agnes is like, well, I still don't understand what the hype is about. And Marian is like, well, Peggy went there and she'll write about the presentation. And Agnes is like, well, then I'll read about the presentation. And yeah, Agnes isn't happy about the entire electricity thing and whatnot. And this is where Marian is like, well, I wanted to go, but I couldn't go without your permission, right, Aunt Agnes? And Agnes is like, what's happening here, Marian? You're being way too obedient. What are you going to spring on me? And Marian just walks away. And yeah, I think Agnes realizes that things with Tom are becoming serious, and Marian is basically going to tell Agnes that she's going to marry Mr. Tom Raikes, and let's see how Agnes reacts to that. So we're at the presentation and everyone is having a fun time, and Tom Raikes is basically connecting with Miss Bixby. He's pouring her drinks and whatnot, and yeah, Aurora Fane is looking at all of this, and there's this scene. I think it will come later. Yeah, over here. I'll talk about it in a bit. So anyway, everyone is talking about going to Newport and spending time there. And Mr. McAllister is like, yeah, let's go to Newport. And I guess, Tom Raikes ends up getting invited as well. And the upcoming episode is titled Tucked in Newport. So something bad might happen. Again, let's see if Bertha ends up inviting Marian or not. So as Miss Bixby and Mr. Tom are talking, Aurora Fane notices it and she makes this expression, and I'm like, you know what, I think she feels bad because she knows that Marian likes Tom Raikes. But let's see if Aurora Fane steps into these two connecting further. But yeah, again, let's see what happens. So Agnes ended up going to sleep on the sofa while Ada is doing her cross-stitching, and Marian just looks longingly out the window because she wanted to go to the presentation and basically no one invited her. Poor girl. So Mr. Fortune and Peggy are at the presentation and they're very, very excited about it because it's about to happen. Thomas Edison is going to use electricity quite soon. And as these two are talking, this is where Peggy is like, well, a whole lot of people here are very excited about the presentation. However, some of them are wondering when the POC community will end up getting electricity in their homes. And these two are becoming close. And as I said, I'm here for this. So it's time for the presentation, which is titled Lighting the Way to a Better Future. Everyone is introduced to Mr. Thomas Edison. Mr. Russell makes a little speech. He tips his cap to Bertha and whatnot. And yeah, Mr. Edison pulls the lever and we end up seeing the New York Times building being lit up by all with electricity. And at first I was like, is something going to happen? Is something going to go wrong? Is the building going to catch on fire? But no, that doesn't happen. And of course, everyone is in awe of the building and the use of electricity and whatnot. So yeah, everyone is excited, and the episode basically ends with Mr. McAllister telling Bertha that, you know what, this is a pivotal moment in human history. We're going towards the future. However, I'm not really sure if we're headed in the right direction. And Bertha is like, well, we basically have no choice in the matter, do we, Mr. McAllister? We have to go where history takes us. And this is where the episode ends. Again, George's lawsuit is still a thing. I'm not really sure if he'll be able to survive it by the end of the episode, by the end of the season. Maybe there's a huge scandal. I felt bad about Marian, and Tom Raikes wants to marry Marian. So let's see how all of that works out. But yeah, let me know what you thought of the episode down in the comment section below. And until next time, stay happy, stay safe, stay blessed. See you guys later. Bye.